Alright, so this is kind of a graph theoretic formalism for the Jungian archetypes. I call it vectorized will. Essentially, it's kind of awareness of the fact that the cognitive functions have time orientations. So I'll start over here with the cognitive functions. You can think of extroversion as a kind of expansion in combinatorial time, and introversion as a compression in linear time. So intuitive functions are future-oriented. You can also think of extroverted intuition as shared will, and introverted intuition as this one should be self-will. Anyways, essentially you can think of it as, if you have nodes which represent states, then the extroverted intuitive person likes to think combinatorially about the evolution of the states towards a future state, or the possible future states for any given state. Whereas an introverted intuitive will be thinking about their current state, and they may have an unconsciously processed extroverted intuitive background, but they're focused on a final state and whatever they have this kind of linear view of wanting to get to that one final state. Okay. Then you have the sensing functions. So extroverted, think of it as expanded combinatorial time, and introverted, compressed linear time. For example, there's some random states. Some person may think back to, so these are all past oriented to present. So the extroverted sensing type will be sentimental of, they have a shared sentiment of, so these nodes can be the states of other people or past states of themselves, depends on whether they're kind of recursively processing this within themselves or with other people, although they will struggle to do this within themselves because then that becomes introverted sensing. They're compressing the linear time from their own past. Whereas for extroverts, they need other people because they're actually processing combinatorially the sentiment across all people. So that's why the time orientation is combinatorial for extroverts. And so when you kind of reduce these to this graph formalism, the SI is actually equivalent to a node. It's like the saved state. Whereas the extroverted sensing is a lot like a connection between nodes. So multiple of them will just be more connections between nodes. They're very primary, even though the vectorization of will is primary to having an evolution of these nodes. You can have, without sensory input, without memory-based sensory input, which is the archetypal introverted sensing, or sensorial physical presence of SE, you don't have the data to process for the intuition. Even though intuition is more primordial, they feed into each other. Okay. Then you have extroverted feeling and introverted feeling. These actually are such as a combinatorial too. So these are in complex time. So like the complex plane. Essentially, if you're using value forming, you are not processing in the traditional sense of time. You are acting outside of time in potential times and superpositions of potential times. In the combinatorial sense of an extrovert feeler, they're averaging the shared values of many people, and they're kind of doing this convolution in order to produce their perception of what the moral structure of the environment that would be appropriate is. Whereas for an introverted feeler, they have this kind of linear complex time that it's kind of, what really it is, they're bounds on imagination. These are bounds on imagination of the group versus bounds on the imagination of the individual in complex time. So these are the self values of an individual person. They can, it also shows in their imagination. An introverted feeler finds it easier to imagine a progression, like a narrative, which is why introverted feelers often like to imagine stories, and it depends whether they're any dominants or SA dominant and how those work. But anyways, let's go on to extroverted thinking. So this would be shared knowledge, and TI would be self-knowledge, would be understanding. Essentially, you can think of it as if you were to rationalize a space, it would be something like making the paths from states more orthogonal, you're reducing the complexity essentially, and this is more like rule space. So if you know Stephen Wolfram and cellular automata, computational reducibility, there's this idea of rule space, and extroverted thinkers are people that are essentially working in the rule space-time. So they're working in terms of computational reducibility, and that allows them to select or to expand on the possible rational choices. So they're constantly looking to their exterior they're usually connected to the sensory data, although there is the ESTJ that's connected to the intuitive potentiality of future states. But anyways, this is why the evolutions of states kind of expand. They're looking for many rational solutions, and if there's complications, other rational ways out. Whereas the introverted thinker has this kind of single rule space. So they're looking through all the rule space, usually in their unconscious or their intuition or whatever, the sensory, if it's an ISTP or if it's an INTP, and they're selecting this in the terms of indeterminism and determinism, this linear time in the rule space that is the most logical. And they may have one based, if you were to force, for example, if you were to force instead of into this state, an INTP or an ISTP, they may have the most logical progression once you're at this state as opposed to this state. So if you force them into this one, the logical state might be like this or something, just as an example. And so they have the most logical progression regardless of where you are in this graph. Assuming you can progress at will from the beginning, this would be like the most logical. So it's just a representation of the fact that there's one path. So once you have this formalism, you can construct it for any personality. So I'm constructing it for the INTJ. So the INTJ has the self-will, NI first, so they may have some kind of states that they know about and a state that they want to get to, B. And they may know they need to get through another state to achieve that state, so they may need to go through B, through E to get to B, and there may not be a direct path in terms of the unconscious processing that they have extrovert intuition, which I'm not showing yet. Okay. Then they rationalize the space, so they reduce it, so it's computationally reducible. They know rationally the decisions that need to be taken to get to the step, and this is only in the consciously aware space. This is also, if you think about it, this is a lot like an impartial game. They have it, if you've seen the last video on the games, you have essentially the choice or to make B the final state or not the final state, D the final state or not the final state. So it's regardless of which game they choose, they have the impartial choice of maintaining that as the illicit game. Whereas the rational space is more like the explicit rules of the game. In their mind, it's the potential moves that can be made. And then you have introverted feeling, which for the INTJ is the values that limit the rational matrix towards their goal. So, for example, you can see this wave function, the sinusoidal wave. It's essentially a bound on the rational space that the INTJ would not like to escape from, but from which they can imagine states given their initial state. So, assuming they're at E, they can kind of imagine themselves at H, because it's still within the bounds of their value space. But they do not want to go to D, which is outside this value space. If they did, they'd have to have a rational solution for getting back out of that state and into the bounds of their value forming. They may also have to go, for example, through I and E, because in this value space, they are necessary, for example, to preserve image or something for the sake of getting to the goal of B, whereas prior they only want to have to go through the state of E in order to achieve B. And really every corner is a state, but I'm just labeling some of them just as an example. these are like implicit rules in a game, and the extent in which this sinusoid expands is the expansion of the explicit of the space of explicit rules. So at first it was the entire square. Now it's just as bound on the values of the sinusoid, and so you can see how this associates with Fi and the sinusoid and the rational space of Te and the Ni, the goal. So it all just gets superimposed. Finally, they have Se last, which remember is like a bound in terms of combinatorial time on past to present. So this, depending on the final state, once they had achieved that final state, there's possible evolutions in which, right, it connects to past states. Like it could have been to this state, this state, this state, all the states. They could have all had circles, but I'm just giving an example of a labeled state, which was C, or here. So there's this kind of past sentiment, and there's a bound on, you can, inside of all of these circles connecting different states, there's a value bound. So the kind of bounds, the values, this is the values that that an INTJ, he or she, did use in the act. This is like in the act of the sentiment of that action, of this state of action, evolutions of states. So if he had been forced out of this value by some weird condition, like he just had no choice, he would want to get back into the bounds as much as possible. That would depend on a lot of context and on the sentiment state, defining the value within these sentiment states. And so the shared sentiment could be, for example, he had to help someone and was forced to help someone. It limited their ability to get to limited their ability to get to their state as quickly as they wanted to, but for rational choices they had to. And so these are bound, these bound values based off perception, so because they're tied at the end, Fi and Se, just like Te bounds Ni. So now that you have this Te space, Ni is hyperfocused within this Te space. Very unlikely that they'll form a goal outside of this Te space. The Te space is linked through a loop to Se, so it grows with Se just as Ni grows with Fi. So if Ni were to expand in another angle or further away or something, then Fi would accommodate to that. And so they're associated, you could think, angular-wise, and in extroversion in terms of expansion is kind of like the rule space, the potential places where states could evolve from or to. And so this is a lot like partial games. It's kind of the extent to which implicit rule changes can occur, right? So there's this context for the extroverted sensing where the implicit rules that he had as an individual in this extroverted thinking space is now tied to a shared sentiment. So the implicit rules can change based off of the kind of game he's playing with some other conscious entity. So if he had to make a correction, that would be something like a complex game, because he's still playing the internal game that he had, but now it's become a partial game, but he's still there's a superposition of states in making that decision that collapses based off of the rationality of the shared sentiment. So most of the time, the rationality of the shared sentiment is not sufficient to make them go out of course. Therefore, most of the time they are bound to this rational space, and they will not choose because it's a responsible parent function. It will refuse to allow the INTJ outside of those bounds. But if they do, then that would be an illicit change in the game space. So you can look back on the game video for that too. And so the important thing is actually to think about it now in terms of the INTJ's unconscious. I call it the cohomological game, or the unplayable game. The game that the INTJ plays without realizing it. So you can see this dashed square, this dashed line square, that's the conscious space. Outside of these are these unknowns, which I've just labeled X, in which his ENTP unconscious is acting with extroverted intuition. So it's connecting the wills, the possible evolution of shared will across any states, or people kind of are included as states because it's also the evolution of their states within these states. So and it's associated to the conscious. It's associated with the with itself as the unconscious and as exterior to this dotted line square. So this actually, because it's NE nemesis, makes the INTJ think, like, of course I know how things are connected in terms intuitively better than anyone else in their unconscious. Is because actually this is even greater than in the ENTP, because the ENTP would be bound to the internal conscious space. So, anyways, but it's unconscious to them, so they don't really process that. It's just kind of given to them for the sake of developing an NI and refining it constantly. The TI, as I said, is always knowing the rational path regardless of the state, has the capacity to correct on any possible deviation from the rational space. So if it goes outside the rational space, and this connection of will gets rationalized for the sake of developing the most rational evolution of state regardless of state. So it knows where to go regardless of deviations away from this rational square conscious space. So it makes it incredible. The problem with this is obviously the critic, because the INTJ has this sense that they don't understand enough, that they may know enough, but they don't understand what they know well enough for this to be accurate. And so that self-criticism is kind of warranted because they're outside the rational space. So that's like by definition when they're uncertain. And so then you have FE. FE is an averaging of values. So they're averaging the values of others. This is their blind spot. INTJs have no idea how to do this or if they're doing this, but their unconscious mind does it for them. And it's actually how they average the values across these different states. It bounds the value forming that's possible. So associating itself with FI in just this state, for example, there's an FE space that goes outside even the rational space that is unconscious to the INTJ, that says I'm willing essentially to go outside the rational space in this area and in this area, for example, in these ways, but not here or not here and not here, not to these x's. I refuse, but these x's may be within, in this case analogically, because it's kind of in the direction of B more than going back, but it's just an example. And that's based on the fact that this unconscious blind harmony is overcome by the conscious will and rationality towards getting to this final goal. And at the bottom of their unconscious is the introverted sensing, which is the archetype, memory, sentiment, internal sentiment, which is the bound on essentially the state evolution from A to B, the actual NI totality completed. And so it's the memory of that path, all the thoughts of variations in rational paths they could have taken, different decisions, different feelings, different moralities, etc. It's the bottom of their unconscious, and as I said, it reduces to a point. So this is a lot like a compression of a state evolution. If you think of what I call the metagame, which is the evolution of the INTJ's game space throughout their entire life, you can think of it as these squares that expand, right? So this is A, this is B1, this is B2, this is B3, to B infinity, the end of their life, or the as far as they can imagine. These squares, these are conscious squares, and there's these bounds that keep growing around. I could do that too. So at one point, I mean, this is a two-dimensional example of it, but at one point, this space would have been unconscious, and this space outside these squares would have been unconscious, just like this, and like this space outside these squares. So the metagame is really important because as these contract in time, in terms of the perspective of future-oriented, for future orientation, because the introverted, intuitive INTJ is single future linear time-oriented based on self-will, then the sentiments of a state, an entire state evolution from A to B is something like a state that they can just remember in terms of SI compression, the bottom of their unconscious mind. And because SC is so hard to draw, because it's kind of combinatorial and all these circles and stuff, I gave an example of A to B for this. It would be incredibly complex. It would be the shared sentiment between all the states on the grid and every possible other way that you would connect a circle from every other state on the grid. So just look like a mess like this. And the arrows would be going in every direction, both directions across every line. So that's why shared sentiment, extroverted sensing, is the repressed function, what's called the aspirational or the insecure function for the INTJ, because it's actually incredibly complex. Extroverted sensing is a pretty complex function, but it's not. It's the opposite time orientation to single future. It's all past to present. So yeah, let's see. So other personalities are like cohomological games. They're irreconcilable games with the INTJ. If you look at the MBTI explained video I have on the combinatorial stack of a personality, the possible combinations that they can exist, because you have all 16 personalities inside you, just in lesser percentages as you get away from your main personality. Really, your first two kind of describe you pretty well. You are these other personalities during instinctive reactions, when you're sleeping, and very small moments throughout your life. So there's this nth degree theory of mind, which is the idea of I am not who I think I am, or I am who I think I am, but I'm also who I think you think I am, and I'm also who I think you think I am, and etc. And you can reverse it. So you think you are who you think you are, and you are who I think you are, and you are who I think you are, etc. This nth degree theory of mind has to do with the attempt for homeomorphisms and isomorphisms, which are essentially what language are. So you have one of these maps, which is just an analogy for classical and quantum data structures and how they're organized in your brain with a certain time orientation. And you have this nth degree theory of mind, which when you're doing communication by any kind of language, you are essentially trying to translate one into the other, and you're trying to equate them. You're trying to express one to the other so that the other can have the same time orientation as yourself. So these can be internalized or externalized, which is what I was saying a little bit prior. So the introversion is an internalization, it's a linear compression in time, whereas the extroversion is a combinatorial expansion. So if you had all the personalities graphed out, all 16 of them graphed out this way, the ENTP is also here because you just make the bottom conscious in the center, and then you expand this to the kind of the around the square part. So it's hard to visualize now because they're superimposed in a reverse order. But yeah, you would find that there's time orientation symmetries, which actually are really relatable to particle symmetries, like particles and antiparticles. And it turns out that people tend to naturally balance. So if you're with an INTJ, you will try to balance yourself with them. You'll try to, if you're an ISTP, for example, and you're more T than the INTJ will try to be an F for you. But that's only a slight deviation in the time orientation. They will still have these fundamental graphical representations, but they will become slightly more oriented towards the F, which you can think of as having a angular transformation on the time orientation. So this is related to Wick rotations and quaternions, and it has a very fundamental relationship with thinking of a graph theory-like representation of consciousness.